Tonight I'm going to tell you something you never have heard before. Today is December the 11th, 2011. You've heard of that. I have lived 85 years, 9 months, and 17 days today. I sat down and figured this out. I am 31,279 days old. If I ate 1.5 pounds of food every day, I would have eaten approximately 46,365 pounds of food. That's in addition to M&M's, ice cream, Hershey bars. Why is that important to us? Well, somebody says, my word, how in the world did you eat all that food? And you know what the answer is. One bite at a time. One bite at a time. Well, as I was preparing this lesson, I thought about that. That is just exactly the way Satan works. One bite at a time. He doesn't pile that whole 46,000 or whatever it was, pounds of food in front of you and says, eat it. No, he doesn't pile all the evil that he wants you to do together and say, okay, get to work on being a real rascal. No, he says, this is good. Have a bite of it. Isn't that just exactly what happened in the Garden of Eden? He told Eve about how wonderful this fruit was, what it would do for her. She would be wise like God. It looks good, it tastes good, it's got to be good. And that's exactly the way he works on us. A while back, quite a while back, I read an article about a documentary film that was being made about the Jonestown Massacre. You remember that? Back in, what, 1979, I believe, when it was.
36.
Maybe it was, way back there. Over 900 people committed suicide together. And as they interviewed one of the men who was a survivor, he escaped this thing somehow. As they interviewed him, he said, just what I just finished saying. He said, you know, we saw these bad things going on, a little bit here, a little bit over there, and we passed it up, and we didn't say anything about it. And then the first thing you know, something else kind of bad would come along, and, well, it was just kind of the same thing. You know, what is one voice, after all, among 900 people or 1,000? What is just one voice? And nobody said anything. And it was a tragic, tragic, tragic story. But it goes to show what happens when people will not say no. There is a power in saying no. Let me tell you a true story. The fellow who was the vice president of Dave Lipscomb College when I was there was Willard Collins. Willard Collins used to preach at the Charlotte Avenue Church of Christ. Just before him was Athens Claypoulius, who preached there for many years. I knew both of these men. One was president of the school, and the other was a vice president, but just somehow I happened to get to know them well. Brother Poulius said one day that over in Salerno, Italy, at the time of the invasion of Italy by the Allied troops, they had invaded and they'd kind of settled down and things were in order, and a lot of the Italian people welcomed them because they were very tired of Mussolini and the war and all of that. And some of the young men there in the army decided they had liberty. On Wednesday, they decided they were going to go into town, have some drinks, find some ladies, and they would have a lady to spend the night with. This young man one of the young men who was there, good friend with these fellows, they wanted him to go, and he started out and then he stopped and he said, I can't go. I can't do this. Why? Just think of all the fun. Everybody does it. He said, no. He said, my mother, today is Wednesday, and tonight my mother is going to be worshiping at the Charlotte Avenue Church of Christ in Nashville. That church is going to be praying for me, and they're going to be praying for all of us. And he says, I just can't betray these godly people. The other young men began thinking about that. And they changed their mind. And none of them went out to find prostitutes that night. A.C. Pulius expressed it this way. He said, the loving arms of a war mother reached out thousands of miles across land and sea to embrace 3 young men that she never met. There's a power in just simply saying no. I can't do this. I won't do this. And yet we are surrounded by people who entice us, abide at the time. Oh no, they don't tell us about all of the evil. The devil doesn't. He doesn't tell us about all the evil that's going to come. He doesn't tell us about the consequences. He doesn't tell us about the penalties. He doesn't tell us about the unhappiness. He doesn't tell us about the disappointment. He doesn't tell us about the rejections. Just one bite at a time. That's all. Just let this little bit go by, and the first thing you know, people find themselves way, way off from where they started. I like to go fishing. When I was fishing one day, we were in a small boat in a lake, and well, actually it was a lake formed by a dam, and we were just fishing away, you know. And first thing you know, we looked up. We were nowhere near where we started from. We had to crank up and go way back, you know, because just very, very gradually we had slipped away from the place that we thought we were. When they landed a man on the moon, you remember what the statement was when he stepped out of that capsule? One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In a sense, that's again the way the devil works. Just a little step here, a little step there. You won't say no because, after all, everybody does this. You won't say no because it's fun. You won't say no because, well, it's just this one time. There's a power in saying no. Sometimes people, as a matter of fact, Jonestown is a perfect example of this. Sometimes people do things in the name of religion that gradually, very, very slowly get away from the mores, from the anchors that should hold us to the Lord. And, you know, I enjoy church history. And as I read church history, I see developments that came along that took years, centuries to develop. Quite literally, it took centuries to develop. But then when it's developed, it's so far away from the simplicity of the church as described in the New Testament, the life that's described in the New Testament. Why? Because somewhere along the line, somebody didn't say no. I remember when I was in junior high school, there was a Presbyterian preacher near our high school, and he used to come every once in a while and speak to us in our chapel. And he had just come back from Germany. And he told us in junior high school, he said, terrible things are happening in Germany. And he began talking about the rise of Nazism in Germany. Hitler was not the powerful man at that time that he later became. But this fellow began talking to us about these are some bad things that are happening in Germany, and nobody seems to be opposing it. That's the way the devil works. Hitler did not come to power all of a sudden and say, hey, I think I'll kill 6 million Jews. I think that I will invade the Sudetenland and kill some of the people there, the people of Czechoslovakia. No, he didn't do that. Instead, what he did was very gradually to gain power, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And the first thing you know, the world, Europe sat back and looked, and they said, how did this ever happen? One bite at a time. One bite at a time. There's a power in being able to say no. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 that's very interesting to me. Sometimes we don't realize how Satan really works. And of course, that's greatly to Satan's advantage. Let's talk a little bit about the background of this passage. Paul had had a terrible time in the city of Corinth. The church there was, they had a lot of division, and some of them denied the resurrection, and just a lot of things like that. They abused the Lord's Supper. They abused spiritual gifts. One man was living with his father's wife, and just all kinds of things like that. And some of them opposed Paul. They didn't like Paul. They said, well, you know, his bodily presence is weak. Oh yeah, his letters are strong, but you know, there was problems there. Well, some of this began ironing itself out, and Paul wrote a lovely, beautiful, wonderful letter called the 2 Corinthians. If you want to really see something about the mind of this great apostle, sit down and read 2 Corinthians and stop and think about the attitude that Paul showed in that letter to people who had opposed him. And he found out, we don't know exactly how, but he found out that some had forgiven, and they were curing some of the problems. And here's what he wrote. If anyone has caused grief, he has not so much grieved me as he has grieved all of you to some extent. Not to put it too severely. The punishment inflicted on him by the majority is sufficient for him. Now, instead, you ought to forgive him and comfort him so that he will not be overwhelmed with excessive sorrow. I urge you, therefore, to reaffirm your love for him. The reason I wrote to you was to see if you would stand the test and be obedient in everything. If you forgive anyone, I also forgive him. And what I have forgiven, if there was anything to forgive, I have forgiven in the sight of Christ for your sakes. And here it is. In order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. Isn't that a great statement? We're not unaware of his schemes when to try to outwit us. When we learn to say no to evil, we hold up a banner that says, this far and no farther. I refuse to allow anybody to push me into something that I know is wrong. Oh, there are all kinds of enticements that might come along with this. I want to read to you from some of the things in Proverbs right along this line that are just really very, very important to us. There's one here in Proverbs chapter 6. I really like this. It looks on the other side just a little bit. Proverbs chapter 6, beginning with verse 6. He's talking about laziness, getting out of doing things, procrastination. He's talking about how people disregard their obligations and their responsibilities. And so he says, go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider her ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, and yet it stores its provisions in the summer and gathers its food in the harvest. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? Oh, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed man. You see, Satan doesn't need to do anything but entice us to neglect, entice us to sit around and not really do anything in discharging our responsibilities that we know we ought to do. Procrastinate, put it off. And the first thing you know, kind of like Jeremiah said, the harvest is past and summer has ended, and we are not saved. Procrastination, just putting it off. When we need to say no to procrastination and yes to responsibilities. There's another passage over here that I want to read also in the 23rd chapter of Proverbs. Proverbs 23, he says, and beginning with the 29th verse. Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints? Who has needless bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes? Those who linger long at the wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. Do not gaze at the wine when it is red and when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly, for in the end it bites like a snake and it poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange sights, and your mind imagine confusing things. You see, there are so many temptations around us today, and everybody does it, and it's fun, and it's rewarding, and it's just this one time. But the Bible is constantly warning us about these very things. We can't get away with it. There is a price to pay. Someone has said, every time you fail to stand up for what's right, you go away as a different person. Now, that's not an absolute, I understand that, but there certainly is a kernel of truth in that, isn't it? Another thing that Proverbs talks about that's very prevalent in our day has to do with sexual sins. Oh, it's just a common, ordinary thing now for people to live together without being married, for people to commit adultery, for people to be unfaithful to marriage vows, premarital sex, intermarital promiscuity and things like this. It's kind of an accepted thing in so much of society nowadays, isn't it? I want to read to you from the 6th chapter of Proverbs again. A rather long passage. It's not very nice because it speaks of how enticing all of this can be. The power of saying no is so very important here. My son, keep your father's commands. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Bind them upon your heart forever. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will speak to you. For these commands are a lamp, this teaching is the light, and the correction of discipline are the ways of life, keeping you from the immoral woman and from the smooth tongue of the wayward wife. Do not lust in your heart after her beauty, or let her captivate you with her eyes. For the prostitute reduces you to a loaf of bread, and the adulteress preys upon you your very life. Can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Can a man walk on hot coals without his feet being scorched? So is he who sleeps with another man's wife. No one who touches her will go unpunished. These are things that we need to teach our young people. These are things we need to teach older people. These are things that need to be a part of our everyday life so that we understand a little bit more about what God expects of all of us. Notice that the writer uses some enticing terms. He uses the word entice. He uses the word captivate. He uses the word lack, or the expression lack of judgment. None of us like to be like that, do we? We don't like to be thought of as people who are captivated by these things. We don't like to be thought of as people who use bad judgment. But he says that's just exactly what takes place when we fail, when we refuse, when we don't say no. There's one other passage I want to read to you. It's from the 7th chapter here of the book of Proverbs. It goes along the same line. My son, keep my words and store up my commandment within you. Keep my commandments and you will live. Guard my teaching as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablets of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your kinsman. They will keep you from the adulteress and from the wayward wife with her seductive words. The writer goes on down and discusses this a little more fully. The point that I'm trying to make is that I didn't eat 43 or 46,000 pounds of stuff all at one time. I ate it a bite at a time. It took me 85 years, what was it, 9 months and 19 days, whatever it was. That's how long it took me to get it all down. But I managed. That's all Satan wants us to do, is to say, there's not much here. You can stand this. You can get away with this. It's not going to injure your marriage. It's not going to injure your friends. Nobody will know about it. It's just you. And so little by little, he entices us. He causes us to set wisdom aside. He causes us to set morality aside. He causes us to set integrity aside. He causes us to set principles of Christian life aside, one bite at a time. Learn to say no. Learn to say no to the right things. There's an opposite to this. Learn to say yes. Learn to say yes to God. Learn to say yes to the commandments that he's given us. Learn to say yes to fidelity. Learn to say yes to integrity. Learn to say yes to the Christian life. And if you're not a Christian tonight, say yes to him this evening. Say yes to him and be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins. And he will say yes to you. He will say, yes, you are now my child. You belong to me. You can call me your father in a way that you have never been able to call me your father before. We're going to sing a song. If you are in any way subject to the invitation, we invite you to come. Let's stand together, please.